'Cause one thing I've learned is, as much as I believe that everyone deserves to have at least one supportive person in their life, which is why I do the work that I do, because if just one supportive person is in a child's life, then, they can definitely thrive. But I also realize you can't be everything to everyone, and so you really have to empower other people to be able to be what they need or be what someone else needs, so that it's like a continuum of I support you so you can support someone else, and so on and so on. My name is Ladesha Batten, and I grew up in Smithfield, Virginia. As a child, I always was that person who loved to help others, and I was the person everyone came to for advice. And once I started thinking about college, I was a first-generation college student. I knew I wanted to help people, didn't know what that looked like, didn't know what that would consist of, didn't know anything really about social work outside of like the Child Protective Services, Department of Social Services aspect. And so I decided to go the psychology route. I went to George Mason University in Fairfax and majored in psychology. And as I got into my junior year, I came back home that summer and I did an internship at a nonprofit called 4Kids in Norfolk, Virginia. And that's when I really got introduced to the field of social work, because I was shadowing a caseworker, a licensed clinical social worker, and just other individuals who had a social work background. And I started to see a different side of social work and how complex it could be and how much you could do with social work and what serving really looked like in regards to different populations, and started to look more into social work rather than psychology. And even though I love psychology, I love my classes, it was something about social work where it felt more community driven, it felt more on the ground. And so I decided to go the social work route for grad school, which led me to VCU's Masters of Social Work program. Out of grad school, I became employed with Child Savers, and I started off as a crisis clinician or an immediate response clinician. And so we were providing crisis intervention services to kids who were experiencing some type of mental health crisis. Right around that time, there was this big shift with just Medicaid and the way that insurance companies approved like mental health services. And maybe a few weeks into my role, insurance companies decided to back away from approving crisis intervention services, and it became harder to provide those services to kids who were experiencing mental health crises. And so that was one of the first systems I encountered getting into the field, just the whole Medicaid insurance world, and just how it was such a barrier to families who needed those services and no longer could get them, or it went from this one criteria to now like a kid having to pretty much be hospitalized in order to get a service that they needed. Eventually the pandemic came, COVID, which was a whole nother thing within itself. We saw just a spike in mental health things happening with kids as well as adults and just families in general, more trauma cases, and just a lot of need for mental health services in the community, and just trying to figure out, one, how to meet that need of the community while also trying to be innovative, because telehealth wasn't a thing. So like therapy on the computer wasn't a thing back then. And so trying to just be innovative and provide those services while also just managing my own thoughts and feelings about the pandemic and that isolation and fear of, me or a loved one being impacted by COVID and things like that. while that was happening, there was also a lot of political things and just like heightened racial climate with George Floyd and other Black and brown individuals being killed at the hands of law enforcement. It was scary, you know. A lot of people just didn't know how to respond with so many things happening at one time. But I think what people realize is there's power in community and power in voicing your thoughts together and just being together. And so eventually I do feel like the community started to work together and realize the strength that lies in a village. A lot of kids and families are experiencing trauma, unfortunately, whether it's trauma from it's happening within their household or trauma from their community violence. We know that community violence and gun violence has just increased in Richmond communities over the years. Trauma within the schools, you know, a place that's supposed to be safe. Unfortunately, you know, trauma occurs in schools as well. And so a lot of people don't talk about their trauma, or when it happens so often, it becomes normal and you become desensitized. And so you don't even realize that gun violence is traumatic to you anymore, or death is traumatic because you've lost so many people. It's the norm. Just providing a safe space, and you know, once one person realizes like, oh, you know, they're talking about this and maybe I can talk about this, or they're able to just build connections with people and really just build their own group of support, because sometimes, you know, you don't realize what a person has been through until they share it with you. And so through group listening, I saw a lot of like individual communities forming within those groups. Like, you know, this person has lost a child and I've lost a child, so let's connect on that and go from there. And so I think that those set group listening sessions really just highlighted the importance of community and people just finding support within. You know, with all of these individuals, both adults and kids experiencing trauma, it just highlights such a need for people doing the work and addressing the impact of trauma with kids and families and adults. I had to learn Richmond and the geographical area, the different groups of people, the populations, like just the culture of Richmond. I used to hear a lot like there aren't as many resources in areas where, you know, there's a lot of poverty and things like that. But what I've learned is actually a lot of resources get poured into those areas. Now, whether, you know, families know about them or what the engagement is when it comes to, you know, those organizations, like sharing those resources and connecting with those families, I don't know, but I do feel like a lot of those areas get a lot of resources, and maybe the areas that are typically deemed as already resourceful may not get as many resources as we think, because there's this assumption that, oh, I live in a community, or, you know, I live in a community where everyone makes at least $70,000 a year, so my kid isn't going to experience trauma, so we don't need, you know, mental health organizations in this area, or whatever the case is. But that's not always the case. I realized that trauma has no specific race, age, anything. Like, trauma impacts everyone. I've learned that, one, rest is important. When you're working with people who experience trauma, you get burnt out easily. The work is hard. We both know that the work can be tough. There's this thing called vicarious trauma or secondhand trauma, and so that's when you didn't experience the trauma, but because you're connected to a person who did, then you experience like the secondhand trauma. And so it's easy for you to feel impacted just as a person who did experience it. And so when you're continuously doing that work, and I came from a place where I feet on the ground, you know, we We have an on-call line where we respond to traumas within a community, in addition to seeing clients who've experienced trauma. And so when having all of that, it gets hard, and you have to find that balance of how do I take care of others and how do I take care of myself, because as a person or as a human, we also deal with things as well, and we're just as impacted with political climate, racial climate, and all of just the systems and just the woe of the world. And so just realizing rest is important. It can be scary. It can be scary to rest, but what I've also learned is rest is resistance. And so sometimes the best thing you can do is step back and take care of yourself and get yourself together so that you can sustain even longer in doing the hard work. When a person wants to come in and make change, it's important to not assume what changes need to be made, but to actually listen to the person who's, experiencing whatever it is, and listen and work together collaboratively in order to create that change. And that builds trust. And once you have trust, then, things go a long way. But a lot of times, when someone not from the community or not familiar comes into someone else's territory, there's this automatic defense or, just lack of trust because they don't know you. They don't know what your motives are. I truly believe that, my role and just, people in the field doing this type of community engagement work, we should be empowering the community to get to the point where they feel like they can advocate for themselves and feel confident in doing the work on their own or beside other people. For me, what's important is working with a group of individuals or working with people who won't give up on the community. As I've said before, everyone deserves to have at least one just supportive person in their life, one person who can help you to advocate and just really be there to help build you up. And we're responsible to help others to do that and see that in themselves. And so if you have people who are burnt out or really just don't care or are there for the money, then it's hard to do that work, and it can get frustrating. And that's why I had to rest, because I felt that burnt out, and I know that this is the work that I'm passionate about and I want to do, and so I had to step back so that I could do the work even better. I think I've always been just a safe place for people to, talk about hard things and a shoulder to cry on, and have always been a person to stop, listen, validate other people's emotions, provide advice just around, what you should do or other things you should consider. Just feel safe when, and being vulnerable.